a privilege to be able to introduce Professor Olufemi Vaughan. He was the Jeffrey Canada Professor of African Studies and History at Vaughan College. He's now in the process of moving to Amherst College, where he's going to take up the professorship of the Alfred Sargent Lee and Mary Amos Lee Professor in Africana Studies at Amherst. Femi has several important books. A recent award-winning book is called Religion and the Making of Nigeria. It was just launched in Lagos with heads of state and all sorts of important thinkers and scholars and leaders of the Nigerian society were there for a special occasion. Femi has over 50 articles and is published on these issues into his career, and 10 books. He also wrote an award-winning book called Nigerian Chiefs, Traditional Power and Modern Politics from the 1890s to the 1990s at the University of Rochester Press. He's also a senior editor of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia in African History and was a fellow and public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. And Femi has been with this program since its inception 3 years ago, and it's an honor to have him here. Femi is going to speak about the Islamist resurgence and state crisis in Nigeria. And I'll just say very briefly, not to steal some of the education that I received from Femi, but that in a sense, and rightfully so, that we perceive politics and history sort of from the West, from Europe and North America, to the rest of the world, and from the rest of the world to North America and Europe. And what Femi importantly is doing, especially in relation to the study of anti-Semitism, he's looking at the relations of West Africa through North Africa, to the Maghreb, into Saudi Arabia, and how that kind of channel of influence in politics and religion affected West Africa, and it ties into what we're doing in a very powerful and important way to see that, to really exemplify how the study of anti-Semitism isn't a parochial Jewish or Israel issue, but it's really something that touches on so many other issues. So it's really an honor to have a brother here with us today.
Okay. Did I get this?
Go for it.
I very much like an old school teacher. I feel I need to stand. Thanks very much, Charles, for a very warm introduction. What Charles didn't tell you is we go back way, I'm aging you, it's okay for me to age myself, a good 30 years or so, as graduate students just down the road from Islamist College, as well as also a very dear friend, Carlton. So it's really wonderful to be back. Phyllis is here somewhere. Phyllis, she was very much a mentor to most of us at that time. So it's always wonderful to be back. And to be a part of this very special community. I should also recognize Michelle, and Michelle is in Ireland, working very closely with Charles to make this organization a very special community of scholars as an activist and advocates that it has become. I happen to have the privilege of knowing some of the struggles of this wonderful community over the years. Charles and others have worked very, very hard to make this a really special community, and most of us are really the better for it. So thanks very much for having me, for inviting me. The subject of my talk, as you all know, is the resurgence of the Islamist movement in Sahelian West Africa, particularly Nigeria. And in some ways, you might feel that I will be talking about Boko Haram, which I will be, but rather, I have to tell you, rather marginally. I want to tell you a story about how I came to writing a book, a particular book. So it's really a story about a book and some of the findings of the book. So it's very much the story of arriving and writing a book. The book that I've lived with is titled Religion and the Making of Nigeria that Charles spoke about earlier. In a number of ways, I have to say first and foremost, I'm not a student of religion, nor am I a student of Islam or Islamist movements. No, I mean, clearly I'm not a student of anti-Semitism, although I've been really privileged to be a part of the conversation coming out of this wonderful community. So I come to you very much as a learner, not as a teacher. And I would really love to hear from you after my talk. The book itself, I'm just going to pass the book around if you don't mind. Please feel free to take a look at it. And I'll tell you about how I came to working on this book and how in so many ways this book really surprised me. The book itself was conceived out of a post 9/11 world. I was teaching at Stony Brook University. I see a fellow Stony Brook person here, Seth. I haven't seen Seth in a long, long time. I arrived at Stony Brook as an assistant professor, tenure track. Seth was just about finishing his PhD in history at Stony Brook at the time. And if you are in New York, or in the New York City area, in that metropolitan area, when that tragic event happened, that tragic event that, I mean, I knew at the time that tragic event would change the world, and it did. I mean, I think we all know it transformed the world completely. I knew after that horrific strike that our world will never be the same again. I knew that precisely because even more so because I was in New York. And because if you're teaching at Stony Brook, you're teaching undergraduates, not so much as graduates. Most of the kids you see, I don't of course don't call them kids, I mean most of the students you teach are actually students from the metropolitan New York area. Most of them are also from Long Island. Most of them, some of them know people who were directly affected by that tragic event. And I have to tell you, I remember the course I was teaching that particular fall semester. My students were stunned and dazed completely for the rest of the semester. As you know, I believe it happened in November. They just simply couldn't speak. And you know New Yorkers are not particularly shy. They talk and they speak their mind on a regular basis. And another thing I picked up in that experience was just the local newspapers. The local newspapers, particularly those newspapers that you pick up in the grocery stores that you never paid for. I saw so many people who were directly affected by that tragic event. Most of them were New York firefighters and New York policemen. And you get a sense of their family story. And it was really a very horrific event in so many ways. But I was born and raised in a part of the world where, unfortunately, where in a way, these kinds of events, I mean, certainly nothing as dramatic as 9/11 happens, but if you are raised in Nigeria, I mean, certainly not my part of Nigeria, questions pertaining to religious violence are quite common, particularly in the central part of the country and in northern Nigeria. And oftentimes we tend to understand this to be some kind of a clash of civilization, one which is endemic in the character of Islam. I knew very early, as a kid growing up in Nigeria, that kind of narrative is just simply false. It's erroneous, fundamentally. And the reason why I knew that from the onset is precisely because I knew that there are so many Muslim communities in Nigeria where Christians and Muslims and people who believe in indigenous African religions live, quite frankly, side by side in peace and tranquility, where people respect one another. So the very assumption that Islam and Christianity or Islam and Judaism will inevitably have a clash, for me, was an idea that I knew was just simply wrong-headed. There's got to be other variables that we need to reflect upon. And other variables we need to think about is really questions of the ways in which power is configured. In other words, politics is relevant in these kinds of struggles. And I think these questions will not surprise you in any way. And of course, also historicity is important in these struggles. So it's really very important to, and I say here historicity not just so much as an historical perspective. By historicity, I mean the ways in which the historical past, the past is always informing and shaping the structures of the present. So the past is never really without the present. So history here is not just simply a narrative of the past, but ideas and narratives that shape the structures, ideologies, doctrines in which we construct our present world. At any rate, it was really in that moment that I felt a need to begin to interrogate this subject in the context of 9/11. So for me, a combination of what one might refer to as an exogenous and endogenous factor. The endogenous factor is really the particular story of Nigeria that I know very well, and more so the story of the West African Sahel that I at least paid some marginal attention to as a student of that part of the world. The exogenous factor is the narrative and the discourse of a post-9/11 world. Right? A post-9/11 world which is now being conceived within a larger narrative of the war on terror. And for me, I needed to make a strategic move. And it shouldn't surprise you that scholars or students make strategic maneuvers all the time. We all need some support for our research. We need money, to put it very crudely, to do the kinds of work we want to do. And I knew that the funding stream for this kind of research will begin to come, or at least it's already started. As I said, I'm not a student of the subject, but I had to train myself gradually to begin to become a student of religion and politics in West Africa in general and Nigeria in particular. I wanted to do a long article. I wanted to do a book, a comparative work on a couple of West African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal. Those were the three countries that I was thinking about. I applied for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship without knowing, quite frankly, what the heck I was doing, but I was fortunate enough to get the fellowship. And that really encouraged me to think more and more about Nigeria. It wasn't until I got to the Wilson Center that what came out as a result of this book, the book I'm passing around, became, in so many ways, just conceived as a possible reality. One of the real opportunities of being a Wilson scholar, Wilson fellow, is not so much the funds they give you, although that is important. And for those of you who might be interested, please, I want you to consider applying at some point. You can apply at any stage in your career. And as most of you know, it's a truly distinguished fellowship. It's also fiercely competitive. But in terms of the evaluation process, people are evaluated basically where they are. And it's not just simply open solely to scholars alone. And it does have a very strong international component to it. So those of us who are not from the United States are also encouraged to be Wilson scholars. The point I want to bring out within the first few months of this fellowship program is, if you're a Wilson Fellow, you have access to massive government documents, essentially non-classified, of course, non-classified documents. You have access to virtually everything in the Library of Congress, anything under the Smithsonian Institution. So for me, my own area of exploration obviously is Nigeria, and I went to the Library of Congress, the African section. And when I went to the African section, I saw loads and loads of newspaper articles that just scared the daylight out of me on northern and central Nigeria. These questions are not issues I don't know. These were the reports on the Sharia the Sharia crisis in northern and central Nigeria that started, thank you very much. Yeah, that started about 1999 and it went on till roughly about 2003, 2004. Religious violence in Nigeria, Christian-Muslim violence in northern central Nigeria is not unknown, but this one was different. It was different because it was protracted. It wasn't sporadic. It happened over a long period of time. I knew the time when it was happening, but now it's a couple of years after. There's actually something quite visceral when you're reading newspaper articles and reports on really tragic, horrible events in real time in a library. Because what it does to you, at least what it did to me, was something I just simply will never forget. The point is, when you're reading newspaper articles over time, you're not reading them all at the same time. Right? So you're reading the New York Times or the London Times, the Guardian or what have you. You're reading them from day to day. So the news, whether they're tragic or bad or whatever, you're receiving the news in bits and pieces. But when you're reading a bunch of newspapers over a period of 3-4 years on what is clearly a carnage, and you're sitting and you're going through the newspapers day after day after day, you come back the following day, you look through it again, it does something to you. The images are incredibly powerful and very scary. And at that point I knew that I had to write a book, not a comparative studies on Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal, but I had to write a book initially on religion and the making of Nigeria. That's what eventually became the title of the book. Actually, what was of interest to me was Christian-Muslim relations in northern and central Nigeria. Central Nigeria is also generally known, in terms of Nigeria's geopolitics, as the Middle Belt region of Nigeria. I'm going to be saying a bit about Nigeria later. So, in all this, with all this initial information, I was tempted to do one of two things. I could either engage in a conversation, in a discourse that will be driven by the logic of a post-9/11 world. That is to say, the growing momentum of the idea of the war on terror. In other words, do a conventional public policy type of work, cum scholarship, the kind of work that will come out of major Washington, D.C., New York, perhaps Paris, London, policy institutes. And scholars do that, and they do it very well. Well, I can do something actually a lot more conventional that scholars do, and that is to pay attention to that extremely influential discourse. It's a very powerful discourse because they control the media and they shape our imagination in profound ways. Now, I can do something a bit different, a bit along the lines of what you all do. Something that will be based on the kinds of research and scholarship and teaching that we engage upon. I elected to do the latter, not the former. And the reason why I elected to do the latter is because, quite frankly, I just knew that is the right way to go. I knew Nigeria and West Africa enough to know that is the right way to go. To know, quite frankly, that what is in vogue and what is popular is reasonable to engage and to think about, to take advantage of that moment, but to complicate that conversation. To complicate that conversation as students and scholars and learners and teachers that we all are. And I do feel that in so many ways, to the degree that what I believe that AGEP does and does so brilliantly is really the Summer Curriculum Institute. AGEP does so many other things very, very well. But for me, this is a very special community. I say this everywhere I go. So how can an Africanist like me, who is not in any way a student of your subject, of our subject, of anti-Semitism, make a contribution to your conversation, to our conversation? What can you learn from me, or what can generate a conversation? So I'm thinking really curricula, because I do feel that whatever we have to say, although we have to say it within the context of our scholarship and our teaching, but they must have a curricular dimension to it, because this is really about the ways in which we construct and build the curriculum. And even if we do it, we can do it rather loosely. We don't have to impose a rigid idea of curriculum. And we also have to think pedagogically, because in part we are teacher scholars. So in a sense, part of my talk will reflect on curricular and pedagogical questions with reference to this book in particular. So the materials I collected from the Wilson Center, newspaper articles, Nigerian government reports, reports from various Nigerian religious institutions. Religion in Nigeria is incredibly vibrant. Everything about Nigeria is about religion. Nigerians take their two world religions of Christianity and Islam very, very seriously. And Nigerians take politics extremely seriously. And of course, their political discourse are highly subjective too. That shouldn't surprise us. It's an incredibly vibrant country where people are really engaged with serious intellectual issues, and where people really take arguments and debates very seriously. But I got more materials out of the Library of Congress than I would have gotten out of Nigeria. Just loads and loads of materials. Materials that my colleagues in Nigeria will never find in a Nigerian university. Which in itself is another story in time. I was very much like a little kid in a candy store. I just copied everything. And I packed them all away. And I knew at that time I had to do this book. But what's really very interesting about all the primary sources that I was getting out of the Library of Congress, they were all telling me one thing. The story of Islamist resurgence and insurgency and militancy in Nigeria is actually not new at all. They're really very old stories. That's the first thing that jumped at me. The stories of religious violence, that is to say, what is Christian-Muslim violence, in northern and central Nigeria have a strong political foundation, historical foundation. You can just see through reading some of the materials. Now the question really is, how do I work with the primary materials first? And how do I manage that in a good liberal arts college, as they call it, where you cannot just simply be a scholar, you also have to take your pedagogy very seriously. So unlike a Research One university where I used to teach at Stony Brook, where you can, where you can focus your attention on your scholarship and your research and pay less attention to your undergraduates. At Bowdoin, a highly selective liberal arts college, one of the most selective liberal arts colleges in the country, you just simply cannot do that. You have to be a good teacher. You have to be a good teacher. Now the question really is, how does one balance that together? Now, so I want to move into the second part of the story of writing this book. In trying to do the book and having the perspective of 18 years in a Research One university at Stony Brook, I think I could see what most of my colleagues at Bowdoin might not be able to see, those who started their careers at Bowdoin, because I have this comparative perspective. At Bowdoin, and this might be useful to some of us, at Bowdoin, undergraduates really encouraged to be a part of their professors' research projects. So you can imagine 18, 19-year-olds who can read what we're reading, and guess what? They may not have the context, they may not have the background, but analytically they will really dissect it for you. And they'll do it very, very well if you guide them through the process. So we always have resources to incorporate students into our research projects. And I just took advantage of it. Every summer, I had 3, 4 students working with me as my research assistant. They're always well paid. They spend 3 months with me. So as I went through the entire process of reviewing my primary sources and looking through the secondary sources, book chapters, monographs, scholarly articles, pamphlets, and so on, I was really constantly having a conversation for 2 years or 3 years with these incredibly bright young people who were just intensely engaged with my work, sometimes even more than me. They kept me going, they kept me active, and they also kept me really honest. And they came from virtually every part of the world and every part of the country. They were able to see what I couldn't see and ask very probing, difficult questions. The reason why I feel a need to evoke the role of these young people in terms of the kinds of work that we do is because I don't want us to take for granted the significance of what students can do, and it doesn't have to be in a very highly selective liberal arts college. We can find these kinds of students in any place where we teach. A lot of our doctoral students, for those of you who teach doctoral students, are very much like that anyway. So I am really the better for it because I very quickly incorporated students into my conversation in terms of my own work. You will see in the acknowledgement that altogether, I think at various stages early in the book, I had roughly about 8, 10, 11 students who were working as my research assistant. There's another connection to students in writing this book. Because of the conversation that my students were generating, the questions they were asking, the probing questions they were asking, and because of the importance of teaching at a place like Vaughan, that encouraged me to design a course. And the course I titled the course, Christianity and Islam in West Africa. And I'm not suggesting we all should do this, but I structured the syllabus for that class along the various sections, subsections, and rough chapters of the book. In other words, my students were reading what I was reading. They were reading essentially the secondary scholarship I was reading. They needed help, to be sure. They weren't reading textbook materials. They were reading what scholars write. They were also engaged in some of my primary sources, not a whole bunch of it, but quite a bit of it. There's something really wonderful in retrospect about that kind of a strategy. It has a way of bringing teaching and scholarship and research closer together. We oftentimes think and talk as though research and scholarship lives in one world, and teaching, particularly teaching undergraduate, lives in an entirely different world. In this particular instance, it was very clear the two just intersected very well. As I carried on the writing process, the thinking process, the analytical process, my students were also writing review essays based on articles, book chapters, monographs that I assigned for the various topics in the syllabus. They were all required to give seminar presentations. It's a small seminar. In a place like that, you can teach a seminar of 12 students. Also, students who are likely to register in a class like this, it's going to be highly selective because the subject is very narrow, obviously. So students who don't feel they want to engage subjects of Christianity and Islam in West Africa just simply won't do it. Most of what they read were on Nigeria, although they had a comparative perspective of other West African countries too. So in a very intentional way, my students were reading and thinking about what I was reading and thinking about. And now, this went on for roughly about 4 years. If you've never done anything like this, prior to this particular time, I'd never done anything like this. I know generally scholars don't do things like this. We're never really encouraged to do things like this. To most of my colleagues at Vaughan, most don't do this. A few have done it. But for me, moving forward, I have to do it every single time because of the value of what came out of it. I was not just simply being the teacher, I was also becoming really the student. It's a good thing when we as teachers, as professors, really become the student of our students. In other words, they're having a conversation with us on their own terms. So we're really sitting with them. Pretty much, yes, we guide them through the materials. And I know for a fact that we can't do this with all of our students, I know. And I know that you do have you need some students with a particular kind of analytical capacity to really engage these issues, but there were students in those classes who were not really as well prepared, but who were really conscientious and who were engaged. So it's really about the depth of the conversation and the intensity of the conversation as a rigorous scholarly conversation. One where analytical thinking is of the essence, and where writing and making sure your writing skills, or you have to take your writing very seriously. Your capacity to communicate verbally and effectively is just really essential because they all have to give a seminar presentation on a variety of topics, and they have to engage on debates and discussions on the material. All the in this particular class, for this seminar, there were no exams. They were all analytical review essays. 5 of them, literally one every 2-3 weeks, so a lot of writing. And essentially, it's not so much the length of the papers, but the quality of the papers, essentially 8 to 10 pages. So it's really a lot of writing. And these young people really hung in, and they surprised me. And what they wrote challenged a lot of my own assumptions. They really did. They really took me to places I just never assumed I'd want to go. But what's really very important about that conversation, and what was intense about that conversation for me with my students, is that they took historical analysis very, very seriously. For one thing, I imposed that on them. It's very much the prerogative of the chair. They had to engage the historicity of Nigeria, and they have to take Nigeria on its own terms, not on the terms of the West. They have to be aware of the moment in which they're reflecting on these subjects, as the moment, as I mentioned earlier, as the moment of war and terror in a post-9/11 world. Appreciating moments in history is absolutely essential. We should not be captured by it. So we need to be able to take advantage of it, reflect upon it. But we really have to know that people in other parts of the world have their own particular histories and experiences. They really do. And those histories and experiences are way more complicated than we can ever imagine. There's a lot of story there. And that became very much the story of this book. Now, let me say a few things about the structure of the book and some of the findings of the book. The structure of the book has a lot to do with the way I've always approached my own scholarship. So there's a subjective intervention there, and I think if we're all going to be honest, we all do it. And that subjective intervention is, I cannot do my work as a comparative political scientist and a historian without taking historicity seriously, a kind of a lingerie. I do feel very strongly. As a matter of fact, I'm completely convinced that structures matter a great deal, more than we as scholars in the humanistic social sciences would like to admit. I push against assumptions that are heuristic and tediously, positivist. And history in this context is not about an historian's craft. That is to say, it's not about the question of causality, but really about structures of the past and the kinds of ideas, ideologies, doctrines, practices that those structures generate over time. That in so many ways, the kinds of chronology that we've come to impose on most non-Western societies are quite, in my mind, analytically interesting, but in so many ways actually intellectually erroneous. It's a tedious chronology in which we construct these pre-colonial, colonial and post-colonial narratives. It's an imperial imposition at best. And in that context, what we tend to do is to give the impression that what is tradition and what is modernity actually two very separate domains, rather than to see them as points of constant dialectical interactions and dialogue. Of course, we know that tradition and traditionalism has its own analytical attributes, and modernity has its own analytical attributes. But what makes tradition meaningful and what makes modernity meaningful is because they always have to intersect one with the other. So traditions are essential in grounding modern experiences. I mean, we are, after all, in a place of great tradition. This is St. John's College, Oxford. Oxford is a place where you see tradition everywhere. But Oxford is also a place of immense modernity in terms of ideas. You can't conceive anything remotely Oxonian without really taking traditions very seriously. There is a distinction here between tradition and custom, as we all very well know. So for me, that idea, which is already based on my previous work, informed how I went about trying to do this book. The first desire to push against rigid periodizations, rigid chronologies. The pre-colonial is timeless and in so many ways analytically useless if we don't take it as a serious place where people made their own history. In other words, if we take the pre-colonial essentially as a prelude to the colonial, we'll miss the point entirely. What is the colonial is grafted on the pre-colonial. But the pre-colonial cannot be forever. So in the case of my region and my subject, the 18th century and the 19th century was extremely important. I needed to understand what Islam looked like in Sahelian West Africa in the 18th century, in the 19th century, before the imposition of British colonial rule. I needed to understand that. And I needed to understand that on its own terms, not as a project of the British project of indirect rule as I was taught as a student. I needed to take the structures that Islamic societies in the Sahel created and the Maghreb created very seriously. I needed to understand that that region was a region of tremendous cultural and religious and social interactions and transactions on a regular basis. It was a place of immense intellectual possibilities. It was a place of long-distance travel and trade, not just simply the so-called trans-Saharan slave trade routes, but also a region that has always been looking north and looking east. That people were really making the edge in 13th, 12th century, 11th century, 14th century, northern Nigeria. Think of this.
in relatively, not in large numbers. That people were really having conversations and dialogue with contemporary people in the Sudan. That people were having interactions as far away as Egypt. That the Maghreb was very much a part of their world in a very, very serious way. That clerics came from today's Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco to what is northern Nigeria and Niger on a pretty regular basis. And they shaped the idea of the Arabic language and culture and traditions with local African culture. And people in the West African Sahel also engaged in those kinds of transactions. So it wasn't just simply people coming from the Maghreb or people coming from the Middle East, but also people moving and going back in both directions. Absolutely. So
there are a lot of people from your country.
Yes.
And a lot of teachers in Sharia and tafsir.
Thanks very much. So I mean, in terms of some of the discourses on Sharia, for example, those discourses are not. I really appreciate that they're not new discourses. They're really very old discourses in the new context. But we always want to see the Sharia discussion, which is intense in northern Nigeria, as a new conversation. It's a very old conversation with very deep roots. And I was surprised, as somebody who is not a student of the subject, as somebody who doesn't really write on northern Nigeria, and I'm born and raised in southwestern Nigeria. I'm fourth generation Anglican, so I need to give a bit of my own biography that way. So in other words, I grew up in a place where, with a mindset where people say, although I also grew up in the part of southwestern Nigeria, where if you're Christian, you're bound to have a Muslim relative. And oftentimes your relationship with your Muslim relatives and your Muslim compatriots are actually quite peaceful and wonderful and blissful all the time. So the part of Nigeria I grew up in is actually lacking in any religious conflict whatsoever, let alone tension, none. So where I grew up in Nigeria informed my own thinking about religious dialogue and the possibilities of religious conversations and reconciliation and accommodation. More so than what is the discourse of religion that is always attributed to Nigeria, which is always the discourse of Christian-Muslim violence. So in other words, what is regional in Nigeria is oftentimes defined essentially as a national Nigerian conversation. Does that make sense? In other words, bad news becomes really about the nation. And to be very blunt, Boko Haram becomes synonymous to Nigeria, and Nigeria is synonymous to Boko Haram. And when you go to southern Nigeria and most parts of northern Nigeria and central Nigeria, and I want to talk about Boko Haram because I'm working on Boko Haram, at least a slice of it, tiny bit of it, and people just say, get away from me, Femi, you don't want to talk about that. I think they should be talking about it, don't get me wrong, because I think ultimately it will have an impact on Nigeria. My point is that it is not their world. It is really not directly in their world. In a country with, 180 million people and well over 250 distinct languages, and 5 major geopolitical cultural zones, where if you move from one zone to another, you're a complete alien in your own country. You could very well be coming from Mars. It's not an exaggeration. People see you as distinctively different. This isn't to suggest that the Nigerian project hasn't grown as a national project. It has. But we really need to take very seriously the regional complexity, the ethnic and the religious complexities of most of these countries. Nigeria is a wonderful laboratory to explore these kinds of questions and these types of issues. Because Nigeria's character is many times the character of African countries south of the Sahara. There's no country in Africa, at least Africa south of the Sahara, like Nigeria. That's not an exaggeration. It's just a fact. It's no country. No country in terms of demography, no country in terms of contrast, no country in terms of diversity. Nigeria is probably one of the real classical labs to study the intersections of these two world religions, perhaps more than any other country in the world. In other words, it's not just simply the two world religions of Islam and Christianity living side by side, but intersecting one with the other on a regular basis. Now I'm going to say a couple of things about that. in the conceptualization in how I conceived of this book and how this book evolved. What drove me to the book, as I mentioned earlier, was the carnage of the Sharia riots at the beginning of the 21st century. But what my data, my primary data, was telling me is for me really to dig deeper. The story I was picking up as newspaper reports were also pulling me backwards. I didn't want to go backwards. It was really taking me back to the 19th century and the late 18th century. And I could have gone even further back. And I started the story. And this is where visuals can be a bit small. I have altogether, I think, 7 or 8 maps. And I think the visuals of the maps might tell us the importance of history in some of the questions and issues that we all encounter. I hope this will be useful in your own research and your own teaching. So as you can see, the first map, as I had it, map 1, has political units, Muslim empires in 18th and 19th century West Africa. The reference to Muslim empires in 18th and 19th century West Africa had more to do with the building of territorial states more than empires as we've come to understand them in the modern West. So those 4 Muslim empires, Tokula, Mandike Empire of Samory, Bornu, and the most important of them, Sokoto, which some of you may have heard of, the Sokoto Caliphate, all emerged essentially as major Sufi reformist Islamic empires. So in all 4 areas, there had been major 18th century and 19th century Sufi jihads, most of them Qadariya and some of them Tijaniya. The idea that Sufis don't indulge in jihad is just not true, right? So we have this kind of wonderful mythical ideas that Sufis, as opposed to say Salafi, more peaceful understanding. To be sure, Sufism is more accommodationist in terms of doctrine, in terms of ideas. It's very much open to innovation, it's less doctrinaire, but it's also very expansionist and very territorial. So if one is really going to engage the subject of Islamicist in contemporary Nigeria, or contemporary West Africa, I think this is a very good place to start. But what isn't in this map, particularly by the end of the 19th century, the mid-19th century, what is not in this map, and you won't see this in any of the map, is the arrival of another major world religion, and that is what? Christianity. The arrival of evangelical Christianity, mostly Protestant initially, largely driven initially by the Church Missionary Society, the CMS. I was born and raised CMS. It's really, and these are really the organizations and the movements some of you may know, generated. William Wilberforce may ring a bell in some of our minds.
Can you spell out CMS for us?
Church Missionary Society. Church Missionary Society. Church Missionary Society. So the Church Missionary Society is fundamental in the making of many West African countries, certainly the making of Nigeria. So it's not just simply about a religion, it's also about a way of life. It's also about social questions and cultural questions and so on. And you can now imagine how these Muslim reformist territorial states and their practices and ideas are going to engage the coming of evangelical Christianity, starting at the beginning of the 19th century. One of the central arguments in my book, and this is really one of those very simple ideas that for whatever reason nobody paid any attention to, it's that we cannot conceive of Nigeria, and I'm totally convinced about this, that what is essential and fundamental about Nigeria is really its two world religions. Now I'll repeat that. That the foundation of Nigeria is really the coming together of Islam and Christianity, particularly reformist Islam of a Sufi type. In the case of the Sokoto Caliphate, the Sokoto Empire, and evangelical Christianity, Anglicanism, Methodism, and eventually Catholicism. So those two, think about it, those two world religions in the context of the 19th century were incredibly powerful, unlike, they're still powerful now, but they really shape virtually every single aspect of human reality. They're not just simply about scriptural debates and scriptural text and scriptural interpretations and theological questions. They're really about making society, making communities. They're about civilization and culture and traditions. They're about a way of life. They're about building schools, or what type of schools. They're about curricular questions and pedagogical questions. Most of the first generation, the first two generations of Nigerian schools were essentially mission schools. And as you all very well know, it's really in schools that you socialize the next generation. So the first three generations of Nigerians were almost exclusively educated in mission schools before the arrival of government schools, which came late, and when they came, they were just way too small. So if one is to take education very seriously, as I think we should, you can now begin to imagine the possible conversation between Christian missions in Muslim northern and central Nigeria, what that conversation might look like. I just want us to imagine what that conversation might look like. I mean, clearly it's not going to be tidy, it's not going to be neat, it's not going to be serious. It's not going to be simple. It's going to be complicated and convoluted. And I hope you'll agree with me that it's going to be fraught with what? With power and power configurations. And that should not surprise us. Shouldn't surprise. As a matter of fact, we ought to start the analysis at that point, because they're fundamentally about cultural power and culture and what? And social discourses hinged on the ways in which society is being constructed. So reformist Islam, by its very nature, is expansionist. Expansionist. That is why it's reformist. I'm not making an argument for it. It has certain basic precepts and basic logic, and those basic precepts and logic are the same everywhere at any time in human history. And those basic ideas are one in which you're going through a process of what? Of trying to purify society. It's about building a new society, building a new community, presumably building a new righteous community. The argument is that what is there is not righteous. What is there before, what is prevailing is essentially corrupt. So what is prevailing is essentially corrupt. That is the theology. That is the scripture. That is the message. But if we stop at that message, or the messenger, without taking seriously the context in which that message is being produced, then we lose sight of the most important element of the conversation. It is about the context in which that message is being produced. That story of the 18th century and the 19th century resonates today. So reformist Islam, whether it's Salafi or Neo-Salafi, it's clearly expansionist. It can be brutal and vicious, we all know. It has the potential and the real possibility of being lethal in its propensity to unleash horrible violence, especially when it feels threatened. So what we tend to do is to engage in a conversation about its brutality when it becomes brutal. But what we don't do is to understand and engage how it all started and how that in itself is a progression. It's not just simply something starting with violence, but something that goes through a process. In a way, the argument I want to make, and I want us to reflect upon, is really one of incremental possibility of religious violence. The context matters a great deal. And that messages and ideologies have a place where they resonate. And that is what sometimes we don't want to engage. It's not so much the horrific messages that are being perpetuated and being propagated. It's the extent that in some places, not all the time, in some places, those messages do resonate. They resonate in specific places, and they resonate not because people are in fact backward people, as most of us are likely to believe, or ignorant people because we're convinced they're ignorant. They resonate largely, as a matter of fact, they resonate among very, very well-educated, well-informed people. They resonate because what is prevailing in itself is fundamentally flawed and corrupt, and very much in question, very much in doubt, and one in which the West has been at least, and I'm being very kind here, extremely complacent, if not very much at the core of the problem, over a long time. And the evidence, historically, is very clear. I will move on to the next map. I apologize that I want to do this just by virtue of thinking about the map. So in the case of Nigeria, how much time do I have? 30 more minutes. Okay. Thanks. So in the case of Nigeria, the dominant reformist movement is essentially Qadariya. The Qadariyas are extremely important Sufi movement, global in nature. There are Qadariyas all over contemporary Middle East and North Africa, and all the way to South Asia. Perhaps the most notable Sufi tariq is Qadariya. The second also, I think, will be, I guess, clearly Tijaniya. In other words, the followers of Tijani. So the arrow pointing down, with the success of the Sokoto Jihad in the beginning of the 19th century, you can see the arrow is going down all the way to the Atlantic. The main objective is to carry the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio. By the way, I should just very quickly mention, I'm mentioning all these names. I'm aware that we don't necessarily know them. They're not terribly important for you. But Usman Dan Fodio, very quickly, is the Sufi cleric. Was the Sufi cleric. He was Toronkawa. He had migrated from Senegambia, or at least, not him, his forebearers had migrated from Senegambia as a result of all kinds of transformations in the region. Senegambia from Nigeria, as you can imagine, is very far. If you get on the plane in contemporary Dakar and you fly to Lagos, the flight will take you roughly about 2 hours. And so we know, quite frankly, that Africans were traveling long distances way before colonialism. An entire clan of Toronkawa lived in northern Nigeria. Usman Dan Fodio and his brother Abdullahi Dan Fodio and his son, the first Caliph of Sokoto, Mohammed Bello, essentially led this very successful jihad. a number of jihads are not successful. Jihad by its very meaning is really about what individual purification, but then these kinds of individual purification also have all kinds of connections, right, to ideas of how you build a righteous Muslim community, the Jamaah. And this is really where the subject of jihad becomes very interesting for a purpose. And I feel a need just to mention that as a very, very powerful ideology, and the ways in which you have to infuse this idea into building a new society, a reformist society. A society that would mirror the teachings of the Prophet and his companions, drawing seriously from the Hadith and the Quran. To do that in the modern world can be very tricky at best, problematic at worst. Particularly in societies like Nigeria that are by their very nature multi-religious and multicultural and so on. And also in societies where interpretations and translations and ideas of Islam, even among people of a particular religious a particular Sufi religious tradition vary significantly. So I feel it's really very important to mention this in the context of the kinds of discussions and debates on Sharia. I hope during questions and answer time you'll have questions on the subject of Sharia, which is an important question in Nigeria, and be able to engage those questions even more. But what I want us to get out of this discussion initially is really the expansionist objective of the Sokoto Jihad. This is before the imposition of colonial rule. Now, this map of the 7 maps I'm going to show you is by far to me the most interesting. If you look at the bottom of it, it says map number 5, Islam and indigenous religions in northern Nigerian protectorate, 1900 to 1940. So the British carried out their conquest of what became the Northern Nigerian Protectorate at the turn of the 20th century. Much of this vast heterogeneous region, one of the most heterogeneous in all of Africa, certainly the biggest territorial state in Africa south of the Sahara, the Sokoto Jihad, was conquered by the British in 1903. Within the Sokoto Caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate is really a combination of many emirates, Kanu, Zaria, Katsina, the list goes on and on. Big emirates and small ones. Extremely hierarchical. Some people refer to it as a confederacy. I prefer confederacy. Some people refer to it as a confederation. But what's really very important about this Islamic confederacy or Islamic federation is its sophistication in political structures and political institutions and ideals. That most of the jihadists and the success of those jihadists, the leaders of the jihadists, the jihad of Usman bin Fodio, were not just simply people who were engaged in crass military activities, although that was very much a part of it. And northern Nigeria, on the arrival of the British, will happen to be the largest slave-holding society, arguably in the world, as a consequence of this jihad. So I'm not an apologist in any way, shape, or form for the jihad of Usman bin Fodio, but what I also want us to know that in this military encounter, because we tend to underscore the military aspect of it, it's really a struggle on ideas and the intellectual meaning of how you make and build society and how you build a polity. And that these individuals are really state builders, and consciously so. And they're consciously state builders because guess what? They were also intentionally literate. They wrote, they read, they engaged in debates on a regular basis. They spoke 3 languages. They spoke 3 languages and they wrote in 3 languages, most of them. How many of us can speak or write in 3 languages? I certainly can't. They wrote in Arabic flawlessly. They wrote and extensively. And we have all the records, by the way, or most of the records. So this isn't, and they wrote extensively in their own native Hausa. in Arab scripts. They also wrote in Fulbe. Most of them were actually Fulani, not Hausa. So they were able to communicate with local Hausa people and local indigenous people about the failures of the old Hausa state. They put the old Hausa state on the trial. And I'm not suggesting they won the debate, but certainly they won the debate militarily. But they were not perceived as outsiders, although they were really ethnic minorities. But they were also culturally and socially Hausa. Hausa is the dominant language culture in that area. But as you push, this map is only a section of Nigeria. So in this map, and I'm just going to point, the other part of Nigeria, southern Nigeria, is not part of this map. I intentionally left it out. So this map consists of what is the core northern Nigeria, which is, you can see, I'm going to have to, which is this area. So, areas of Kebbi, Kwadu, Sokoto, Katsina, Kano, Katangum, and the list goes on all the way to Borno. And you can see just around around Big Chan. The neighbors of these southeastern, by the way, the region of Boko Haram, just if I can mention this northeastern Nigeria is this region, all of this region. Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, northeastern Nigeria. You will see in this map the white section, the plain section, mainly Muslim. The second section, Emirates, some indigenous. The third section, Emirates, many indigenous. And the fourth section, independent indigenous districts. So I have a question for us. So please, what does this 5 categories suggest to you? What does it suggest in light of some of the things I've been talking about? What might it suggest? I have here, 4 categories. 1, 2, 3, 4. I apologize. So Emirates, mainly Muslim. Second category, Emirates, some indigenous. Third category, Emirates, many indigenous. Fourth category, independent, indigenous districts. This is 1900 to 1940, under British colonial rule. By this time, the British were in control. By this time, the British and the rulers of the Sokoto Caliphate were essentially best friends, to be sure, without any question. By this time, the British indirect rule system was actually propping up the successor states of the Sokoto Jihad as the rulers of northern Nigeria, and by extension, the rulers of Nigeria. And this is why history, I think, is just incredibly important. In other words, indirect rule using Hausa Fulani Muslim rulers reified their power, essentially suppressed other forms of Muslim competition, and largely ignored indigenous African religions as uncivilized and primitive, and ought to be done away with, by and large. My point is that the British crafted their political project on what was prevailing, what they found. As a matter of fact, more than anything else, they manipulated it and even gave it more power, more influence. That is the essence of the indirect rule system. Well, now, I'll answer my question. Anyone?
Well, there seems to be a lot of different autonomous groups working and interacting with each other. Can you explain the difference between the many indigenous, independent indigenous?
Yeah. Thank you.
And they were generating.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks very much. So the idea of the indigenous is really what we will oftentimes refer to as pagan religion.
Okay.
I just refuse to use that term. And I always say, what do you do with a pagan? I mean, seriously. The idea of the pagan itself, it what? It empties out any form of what? Of real tradition and custom of value. I mean, seriously. Pagans presumably don't have complex, sophisticated cultures and customs and traditions. And the assumption really is that pagans are not able to build big and complex societies. World religions can. So indigenous here suggests that indigenous can become subjects of predatory forces legitimated, right, by colonial rule. It is the pagan. It is the pagan, it is the people, the adherents of indigenous African religions that will become the first casualty of Islamic expansion, reformist expansion. That project was sanctioned by British colonial rule. As a matter of fact, that process accelerated under it. Most so-called pagans were forcefully converted to to Islam, and induced into Christianity. So Christianity here for them is not a matter of religious beliefs. And I want us to explore this question. I'm going to say it's not just simply a matter of a political belief, of a religious belief. Christianity becomes essentially what? A political defense against expansionist Islam. So the conversion process for the indigenous can defend themselves by their indigenous practices. But they can defend themselves by being a part of another world religion, this time a world religion of the British, of the English, although the English themselves are no longer particularly religious. Colonial administrators are not particularly religious. But guess what? The CMS and the Methodist mission and the Catholic missions are particularly religious. But the CMS, Protestants and Catholic missions are not just simply about the religious, they're really about building a new society. So with the missions were also elementary and secondary schools, right? So the people who ultimately were able to become Nigeria's nationalists, Ghanaian nationalists, Kenyan nationalists, we know some of these individuals, Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Obafemi Awolowo, Jomo Kenyatta, they all, the one we know the most, the one that we celebrate the most is, who do we celebrate? Madimbe is of that generation too. Nelson, they all came out of mission stations without any exception. Julius Nyerere, they all came out of mission stations. They were second generation mission kids. Ultimately, they didn't quite play the conservative ideology of the mission. After all, they kicked out the British, to be sure. And then created another, well, we'll leave that alone for the time being. But my point is, I just want us to explore this colonial, pre-colonial intervention, not as a site of religion making, but as a site of society nation making. So the texture of making the modern society, the context of making the modern society, it's by its very nature religious. Because of the ideologies and ideas and practices that it generates, and the institutions and structures and practices that what? That it provides to build a new pathway to modernity. So to see conversion experiences solely as religious experiences, without seeing it for what it is, as sociocultural, political experiences, will be going what? Through an extremely narrow provincial lens. So what I want us to see here is that element of sociopolitics. This is really connecting Nigeria. Connecting Nigeria to the wider world. These are transnational and global interactions. As Christian missionary evangelicals that dominated much of the 19th century and the 18th century, something we don't teach much in most of our universities and colleges, which I think we should teach a lot, quite frankly. We say so much about modernity, but we never really say much about the role of of Christian evangelicals in the making of the modern world. I would argue they're in fact the most important in a post-colonial context, at least in the case of Africa. Their role is seriously understated. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that most of the ways we're teaching the subject we teach in the academy is really empty of religion, of religious practices and institutions. These are questions we leave only to religious departments, which tend to be very small, even in big research universities. At any rate, it's this clash, a kind of a clash of world religions that are essential in Nigeria. Now, the next map number 6, Nigerian regional government 1960 to 1966, oftentimes referred to as Nigeria's first republic. Nigeria gained its independence from the British on October 1st of 1960. After a protracted constitutional discussion all through the 1950s. The 1950s, the period of decolonization in Nigeria. The 3 regions that came out of decolonization, later on 4 regions, those regions are really very different. They're different culturally, they're different socially, they're different in all sorts of ways. In a number of ways, actually, they have very little in common. But they have to find a way to cohabitate, to live together. Consider this for example. Just think about this. Think about bringing together 5 different regions in which the languages and the cultures and the traditions are just fundamentally different. They're not even, these are not languages that are mutually intelligible, where their social realities and experiences are very different. And you have to make something out of that nation, out of that country, as one nation state. And one can imagine how difficult that project will be. I mean, I tell my students all the time that in retrospect, it shouldn't surprise us that African countries are fraught with what? With crisis. Because they're really colonial impositions. We kind of know that. They're extremely arbitrary. By their very nature, we use that language, but we never really explain what that means in real life. In real life, in terms of the shared history and shared experiences of the people who have to make sense out of it. We also bemoan the fact that some of these countries, right, have political institutions that just simply don't serve their people, as though that should surprise us. I'm not making a case for bad governance here. But in actual fact, by its very nature, societies that are fundamentally fragmented, structurally fragmented, are going to be very difficult to have any kind of cohesion in terms of their national hegemonic project. So just as much as Nigerian society is deeply fragmented along ethno-linguistic, ethno-religious lines, ethno-regional lines, and other communal lines, the society itself is also deeply fragmented. So I'm told I have only 2 minutes now, so. Okay. For this session. All right. Let me just go through. At least at least get the map out of the way. And I'm not going to be able to get the map out of the way. Let's just go get some coffee.
Okay, so we have like a few minutes. Is there any sort of quick questions or points of clarification? And then we'll continue at 4 o'clock. Does anybody over here?
Just a point of clarification. When the Christian missionaries came into the 19th century, I'm sorry, when the Christian missionaries came into northern Nigeria,
Into Nigeria.
did they avoid targeting those who were already Muslim? Did they target specifically pagan? Oh, I said it.
No, you can say pagan.
Indigenous.
No, say pagan. Please say pagan. No, feel free to. No, the reason why, I mean, in a way, I don't want to be defensive about pagan. The reason why, pagan is perfectly fine. It's just that the reason why I should clarify why I don't say it is not for political ideological reasons. It's just because I want us to understand the complexities of these.
Right.
Yeah. So is what?
It's simply were the Christian missionaries ever targeting Islam, or were they, I mean, in a concentrated manner, or were they only going for the indigenous?
That's a fantastic question. Oh gosh. That's another question, 2 minutes.
Brother Charles, you can I take?
You take it at 4?
I'll take 4 minutes to answer that. And that's, and this is really the question is really good. In part because of what I said earlier, that by their very nature, these are the two world religions, Christianity and Islam. If there's anything they know, and this is not exclusive to Nigeria, is that they kind of know how far they can go with one another. They learned that a long time ago. It's called the Crusades, right? And amongst other things. They kind of know. They really don't convert one another. They just really, what? I don't want to use the, they pounce on others. Or, other weaker links. That's just the way they operate. So in a way, Christian evangelicals don't convert Muslims, although they would like to. And they always talk about wanting to convert Muslims, right? They write it all the time. So for them, the prized possession is to convert Muslim. But they kind of know that you try and try and try and it doesn't work. At least it doesn't work very well. They kind of learned that in South Asia, and they learned that in North Africa, and they learned that in the Sahel. But they know that one group that you can pounce on and convert is what? Pagans. So I said it, not you. Do you see the point I'm trying to make? So in a way, indigenous religions, and it's not because indigenous people want to be converted to world religions. Indigenous religions, and this is going to be a gross overgeneralization, that I'm going to make indigenous religions incredibly romantic and wonderful, and believe me, they're not. There's something really about indigenous religions that are quite permissive and open. I'm not a scholar or student of indigenous religions. Indigenous religions actually have so many pathways to understand the world. They're not exclusionary, as in the two world religions. The two world religions, by their very mission, are fundamentally proselytizing religions. It's one way, and that's it. You have one path. But indigenous religions will tell you that there are so many different paths to To a good life. And to God. And the world of the indigenous is not the world of heaven and the world of earth anyway. The world of the indigenous is not a world where the temporal and transcendent are clearly divided. The world of the indigenous is a world of negotiations and transactions and debates and discussions within certain parameters and certain rituals and so on, of course. Do you see the point I'm trying to make now? So it's not difficult for indigenous people, the adherents of indigenous religions, say, I will become a Muslim. Okay, you want me to become a Muslim? I'll become a Muslim. Because guess what? I can continue to do my own indigenous thing, too. I can combine the two. Because they've always combined stuff anyway. I can be a Christian. I cannot be a Yoruba. So I may not do that horrible pagan thing anymore, because now we're not supposed to do that. Right? Because you're told by the missions you can't do that anymore if you're a good Christian. But you find a way to encode that into your religious world. Do you see the point? So the divide between indigenous religious practices and rituals and world religions is not as clear-cut as one would imagine it to be. It's a process of constant deliberation, debate, discourse, and translations. That is just constant. A lot of back and forth and movements and so on. If that is the world of the indigenous, a world where religious possibilities and what is intelligible religious, there's a concept of a microcosm and a macrocosm. If that world is a world that you can traverse in all sorts of interesting ways, then you're susceptible to conversion. But there's also another dimension, and that is indigenous religions, unlike Christianity and Islam, provide us with very limited pathways to modernity in a world that is becoming increasingly modern. They're not literate religions. That's the simple idea. They're not religions that you write down. They're based on oral tradition. In a world where you have to write, if you see what I mean, they're intelligent,
They're profoundly intellectual, but they're encoded in oral traditions. Literacy is fundamental to modernity. It's just one example. Literacy will provide you with an opportunity to connect yourself between your own local community, your region, and the rest of the world. So literacy provides you with a global conversation that indigenous religions will not. So in a way, becoming a Christian or becoming a Muslim in colonial Nigeria, colonial Africa is really attractive. It confers on you a lot of prestige and recognition. It provides you with all kinds of opportunities that indigenous religions just simply can't give you. And this is really one of the central arguments in my book, that to understand the role of Christianity and Islam, not just simply as religious, but rather as social and political is essential, and economic is essential. Economic transactions, the global, social, political, are also now played out in terms of these two world religions. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Femi. So first of all, thank you.